Felix Morgenstern's pen slid across the blueprint, making the smallest adjustments to the design of his latest skyscraper. The wall clock in his office showed 9 p.m., but he barely noticed the time. This project was his pinnacle, the crowning achievement of his career. He was so absorbed in his work that the piercing ring of his mobile phone made him jump, leaving an uneven line on the schematic. He almost tore it apart, but the caller ID made him stop. Alaric. His son only called this late if it was something serious. Alaric, what happened? Felix asked, his irritation replaced by concern. Dad, Alaric's voice trembled with anxiety. I saw Mom at the Red Aspen Hotel. Felix frowned. And? Was she meeting someone? Yes, Dad. She was with Dorian, your business partner. The words hit Felix like a physical blow. He sank heavily into his chair, his head spinning. What do you mean with Dorian? Together, Dad. Together. Alaric's voice cracked. Felix's throat went dry. Send me proof. Now. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated. With shaking hands, he opened the photos. There was no room for doubt. Seraphina, his wife of 20 years, the woman who had stood by his side, was in Dorian's arms. His business partner of 15 years, the man who had worked alongside him, shoulder to shoulder. But the worst was yet to come. With growing nausea, Felix discerned fragments of their conversation. Get rid of Felix. We'll take control of the firm. He won't suspect a thing. The betrayal was complete, not only in his marriage but in his business, his life's work. Everything had been a lie. Felix took a deep breath, suppressing the fury threatening to consume him. He needed to think clearly. Alaric, listen to me carefully, he said. Go home immediately. Don't let your mother know that you saw her. Act normal. I will handle this. But Dad, go home and behave as usual. I'll explain later. He hung up, sitting motionless, his mind racing. Then with cold precision, he picked up his work phone and dialed a familiar number. Victor, it's Felix Morgenstern. I need your help. My wife has cheated on me, and I want to initiate divorce proceedings immediately. Yes, I have proof. I also need to freeze our joint accounts and begin securing my assets. No, it can't wait until morning. I'm coming to your office now. Hanging up, Felix gathered his belongings and headed for the door. As he switched off the lights, his gaze lingered on the blueprint on his desk. The uneven line he had drawn earlier slashed across the design, like a crack in the foundation of everything he had built. How symbolic, he thought bitterly, before stepping into the night, leaving behind the ruins of his former life. The next day, Seraphina Morgenstern returned home, still flushed from her encounter with Dorian. The house was dark and silent, not unusual. Felix often worked late, and Alaric was likely in his room playing video games. She switched on the kitchen light and froze. Something was off. The air felt different, charged with an unseen tension. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on a stack of papers on the table that hadn't been there that morning. Her heart pounded as she approached them cautiously. The top sheet bore an official letterhead, notification of the initiation of divorce proceedings. No, she whispered, her trembling fingers flipping through the documents. Divorce papers, bank statements, and screenshots of a video of her and Dorian on the hotel balcony. Blood drained from Seraphina's face as the reality of the situation hit her. Panic surged. She grabbed her phone, frantically dialing Felix's number. A robotic voice informed her that the subscriber was unavailable. In desperation, she called Alaric. No answer. No, she muttered, running upstairs. Alaric's room was empty, his closet half empty. In the master bedroom, Felix's wardrobe stood open. His suitcase was gone. Downstairs, she booted up the family computer, her hands shaking as she tried to access their joint accounts. Frozen, but not emptied. Thank God, she whispered. She collapsed into a chair, her head spinning. How had everything unraveled so quickly? That morning, she had felt on top of the world, confident that her affair with Dorian was safely hidden, that their plan to take over the firm was progressing smoothly. But she should have known. Felix had always been 3 steps ahead, always thinking through every possibility. Of course, he wouldn't confront her outright. No, he had struck from the shadows, methodically, coldly, and ruthlessly. As the shock subsided, fear took its place. Seraphina knew her husband. He wouldn't stop at divorce. He would make her pay for her betrayal. He would take everything she valued. And Dorian? Oh God, did he know? Were his accounts frozen too? Their entire plan was crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. She grabbed her phone again, this time calling Dorian. Dorian! Her voice was hoarse. Do you know what time it is? I know, she blurted, unable to contain her panic. Felix knows everything. A long silence followed. When Dorian spoke again, his voice was tight with fear. What do you mean, everything? Felix, Seraphina whispered. He knows about the affair, the plan, taking over the firm. He froze our accounts. He and Alaric have disappeared. How did this happen? We were careful, Dorian exhaled. Not careful enough to avoid being caught on video, Seraphina laughed bitterly. Dorian, what do we do? After a pause, Dorian said, Don't panic. We need to think. Have you called your lawyer? No, I called you first. Good, here's what we'll do. Call your lawyer right now. We need to get ahead of Felix before he does any more damage. Then we'll meet tomorrow morning to plan our next move. Okay, you're right. We can fix this. Seraphina nodded, forgetting he couldn't see her. But as she dialed her lawyer's number, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She knew Felix. He wouldn't take such steps without an airtight plan, and they were already too late to stop him. Felix's BMW headlights sliced through the darkness as he drove down the deserted highway. Alaric sat beside him, silently watching the passing shadows. They had left the house like thieves, vanishing without a trace. Felix had prepared meticulously, leaving no loose ends. New identities secured through channels he had hoped never to use awaited them at the end of the journey. He glanced at his son, his heart clenching at the turmoil on the boy's face. Are you okay, son? Alaric shrugged, not taking his eyes off the window. I guess. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, a place where we can start over. And Mom? School? My friends? Felix exhaled heavily. I know this is hard, Alaric, but your mother, she made her choice. Right now, we need to protect ourselves. This isn't running away. It's a strategic retreat. We need time to gather our strength and plan our next steps. Alaric finally turned to him, his eyes shining with unshed tears. But why, Dad? Why would she do this? Felix clenched the steering wheel, suppressing his own pain. I don't know, son. Sometimes people do terrible things, but I promise you, we'll get through this together. Alaric slowly nodded and turned back to the window. Felix focused on the road, his mind already working feverishly, constructing plans and weighing options. He had left an encrypted message for his most trusted employee, ensuring his projects would continue in his absence. It wasn't ideal, but it would buy them time. As the miles stretched on, Felix's thoughts drifted to Seraphina and Dorian. By now, they were undoubtedly panicking, scrambling to track his movements. A dark, vengeful part of him relished the thought. Let them suffer. Let them feel even a fraction of the pain they had caused. But he pushed those thoughts aside. Revenge wasn't the goal. Protection was. He needed to shield Alaric from emotional trauma, give him time to heal, and strategize their next moves. And if their disappearance had thrown Seraphina and Dorian off balance, preventing them from hiding assets or fabricating alibis, that was just a pleasant bonus. Under the soft glow of the dashboard lights, Felix Morgenstern's mind worked tirelessly, piecing together the final steps of his plan. He knew Seraphina and Dorian were scrambling, searching for ways to regain control. But they had underestimated him. They always had. The miles stretched endlessly as the car hummed through the night. Alaric silent beside him, lost in his own storm of thoughts. They had crossed the border of the region, and soon they would reach the safe house, a temporary refuge, a place where they could regroup and decide their future. Seraphina sat in her darkened office, her fingers trembling as she sifted through the mountain of legal notices and financial reports stacked on her desk. Each document was a ticking time bomb, threatening to shatter her carefully constructed world. Lawsuits from clients alleging breach of contract, payment demands from suppliers, and worst of all, a foreclosure notice on the firm's headquarters. How had it come to this so quickly? She knew the answer, of course. Everything had begun unraveling the moment Felix disappeared with Alaric. At first, she and Dorian had believed they could weather the storm. They had connections, talent, charm, but as the weeks stretched into months, with no trace of Felix or Alaric, cracks began to appear. Clients grew wary. Architects who once clamored to work with them now eyed them with suspicion. And then the lawsuits had started, one after another, like falling dominoes, each one further destabilizing their empire. A sharp knock on the door pulled Seraphina from her spiraling thoughts. Dorian entered, his once impeccable suit now slightly wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes mirroring her own. "Any news?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dorian shook his head. "Nothing. It's like they vanished into thin air. The private investigator we hired thought he had a lead, but it was another dead end." Seraphina sank into her chair. "We can't keep going like this, Dorian. The money's running out, and if we don't find a way to settle these lawsuits—" Dorian ran a hand through his thinning hair. "What do we do? If we could just find Felix, make him understand—" A bitter laugh escaped Seraphina's lips. "Make him understand? After what we did? He'll destroy us, Dorian. You know that." Before Dorian could respond, Seraphina's computer chimed with an incoming email. She opened it, her eyes widening as she scanned the contents. "What is it?" Dorian leaned over her shoulder. It's a buyout offer for the company." Dorian frowned. "From who?" "I don't know. Some holding company I've never heard of. But Dorian, look at these numbers. This could save us." As they pored over the details of the proposal, neither of them noticed the tiny camera nestled within the decorative plant on Seraphina's desk, silently recording their every move. Miles away in the dim glow of his rented office, Felix Morgenstern leaned back in his chair, a slow smile playing on his lips. The bait had been taken. Just as he had predicted, a chain of shell companies, a trusted intermediary to conduct negotiations. And now he held Seraphina and Dorian's fate in his hands. They were so desperate for salvation that they hadn't even questioned the unusual terms of the buyout. Full disclosure of all financial records and projects, a non-compete clause that would effectively end their careers, and personal liability clauses ensuring they couldn't escape responsibility. Felix chuckled softly. They would sign. He knew it, and by doing so, they would hand him the evidence he needed to bury them completely. A noise from the other room pulled him from his thoughts. Alaric had returned from school. No, not Alaric anymore. Now he was Elias Kirkland. Felix reminded himself of that as he quickly closed the video feed and composed his expression before his son entered. "Hey, Dad," Elias greeted him, dropping his bag on the floor. Felix studied him closely. The dark circles under his son's eyes seemed lighter today. Progress, however small. "How was school?" Elias shrugged. "It was fine, I guess. We've got a group project for history. My partner seems cool." Felix nodded, keeping his tone neutral. Every new friendship was a potential risk, a crack in the armor of their carefully crafted anonymity. But he couldn't deny his son the chance at a normal life. "That's good," he said. "Just remember—" I know," Elias interrupted. "Be casual. Don't share too much personal information." "I'm not an idiot, Dad." Felix sighed. "I know you're not. I just worry." Elias's expression softened slightly. "Yeah, I know." He hesitated. "I'm going to do my homework." As his son disappeared into the back room, Felix turned back to his computer, but his mind was no longer on blueprints. He thought of the events thousands of miles away, where his enemies were scrambling in vain. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, sifting through reports on Seraphina and Dorian's desperate attempts to find him. At first, it had been amusing to watch them flounder, hiring private detectives who repeatedly came up empty-handed. But lately, their efforts had grown more frantic. Debt, approaching bankruptcy. Good, Felix thought. Let them squirm. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to atone for what they had done. His gaze fell on a folder on his desktop, innocuously labeled Operation. Inside were the damning records, emails detailing fraudulent billing practices, bribes to contractors, stolen designs passed off as their own. It had taken months of painstaking hacking and data analysis, but it had been worth it. Very soon, very, very soon, he would spring the trap. and Seraphina and Dorian would learn the true cost of their betrayal. Felix Morgenstern's plan was nearing its final stage. He had spent months watching Seraphina and Dorian scramble like trapped animals, trying to find a way out of the mess they had created. He had taken everything from them, froze their assets, dismantled their reputation, and now they were willingly walking into the final part of his scheme. He had offered them a way out, a lifeline in the form of a buyout proposal that looked too good to refuse, and they had taken the bait. Sitting in his office, Felix watched a live feed from the hidden camera planted in Seraphina's desk. He observed as she and Dorian discussed the proposal in hushed voices, their desperation evident in every movement. They thought they had a choice. They thought they could negotiate their way out. They were wrong. Felix had structured the buyout in such a way that once they signed, they would unknowingly confess to every crime they had committed. The fraudulent financial statements, the embezzlement, the kickbacks, all neatly compiled in a contract disguised as a standard corporate acquisition. Felix tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking back to the day he had left with Alaric. It had been painful, uprooting their lives, but it had been necessary. His son had asked him, "Why did she do it?" And Felix had no answer. There was no logic to betrayal, no justification that could ever make it acceptable. He had seen the pain in Alaric's eyes, the way his son struggled to understand how his own mother had chosen greed and deceit over her family. That pain had fueled him, kept him focused on what needed to be done, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. The following morning, Seraphina and Dorian arrived at the office of the mysterious holding company that was offering them salvation. They were met by an executive they had never seen before, a sharp-dressed intermediary hired by Felix to play his part. The man greeted them with polite professionalism, handing them the final contracts. Seraphina scanned the documents, her heart pounding. Something felt off, but they had no choice. Their backs were against the wall. As she hesitated, Dorian leaned in, whispering, "We have to do this. We don't have another option." With a shaking hand, Seraphina signed. Then Dorian. The intermediary smiled, collected the papers, and stood. "Congratulations. The transfer will be completed within 48 hours. Seraphina exhaled in relief, unaware that at that very moment, Felix was watching a notification pop up on his screen, "Transfer complete." The contracts had been automatically submitted to the authorities. Within hours, the legal system would be flooded with evidence of their crimes. Felix leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It was done. Meanwhile, Elias, formerly Alaric, had sensed the shift in his father's demeanor. When Felix returned home that evening, Elias was waiting. "You did something, didn't you?" Felix met his son's gaze. "It's over." Elias studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good." But Felix wasn't sure if it felt good. The vengeance he had spent months crafting was complete. But as he looked at his son, he realized something. Revenge had consumed too much of his life. It was time to rebuild. 2 days later, the news broke. Seraphina and Dorian were arrested at their estate, their faces plastered across every financial news outlet. Fraud, corruption, betrayal. Felix watched the coverage, but it didn't bring him the satisfaction he expected. Instead, he turned off the television and looked at Elias. "Let's go out. Get some fresh air." They walked through the city, blending in as just another father and son. For the first time in months, Felix allowed himself to breathe. The war was over. Now it was time to start living again. Felix and Elias walked along the quiet streets of their new city, the cool evening breeze brushing against them. For the first time in months, there was no immediate threat, no looming crisis. Felix had won. Seraphina and Dorian had been exposed, their crimes laid bare for the world to see. Their careers were over, their reputations destroyed, and soon they would face the full weight of the law. And yet, as Felix walked beside his son, he felt an unfamiliar emptiness. The drive for revenge had fueled him for so long. Now that it was over, what was left? Elias kicked a small rock along the pavement, his hands in his pockets. "So, what now?" he asked, glancing up at his father. Felix sighed, rubbing his chin. "We rebuild. We start over. But this time, we do it for ourselves, not for revenge." Elias nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. "And Mom?" Do you think she regrets it? Felix hesitated. He wanted to say no, to tell his son that people like Seraphina only regretted getting caught, but he had once loved her. There had been a time when he believed she was his partner in every way, someone he could trust with his life. I don't know, he admitted, but it doesn't change anything. Elias didn't respond right away. They continued walking until they reached a small park overlooking the waterfront. They sat on a bench, staring at the dark waves rolling under the moonlight. After a long silence, Elias spoke again. Do you ever wish we could go back, before all of this? Felix thought about it. If he could rewind time, undo the betrayal, erase the pain, would he? Because the person he had been back then, the trusting husband, the man who never questioned the loyalty of those closest to him, was gone, and in his place stood someone sharper, stronger. I used to, he admitted, but not anymore. We can't change the past. We can only move forward. Elias exhaled, nodding slowly. Yeah, I guess you're right. For the first time in a long time, Felix reached out and ruffled his son's hair. Come on, let's get some food. I think we've both earned a fresh start. The next morning, Felix sat at his desk staring at a blank page. For months, his work had been consumed by his pursuit of justice, his need to take down Seraphina and Dorian. Now he was free. It was time to create something new. He picked up his pen, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, he sketched a future that wasn't about destruction, but about building something better. Elias, meanwhile, was preparing for his first day at his new school under his real name. No more aliases, no more hiding. As he packed his bag, he glanced at his reflection in the mirror. The last few months had changed him. He wasn't just Felix Morgenstern's son anymore. He was his own person, ready to reclaim his life. As father and son left the house together that morning, something felt different. There was no fear, no need to look over their shoulders. The past was behind them, and the future, uncertain but full of possibilities, lay ahead. They had survived, now they would live. The weeks passed, and the weight of secrecy and revenge slowly lifted from Felix's shoulders. He and Elias settled into their new routines, no longer bound by fear or the shadows of their past. Felix poured himself into his work, reviving his passion for architecture. But this time, it wasn't about prestige or proving anything to anyone. It was about building something meaningful. He had spent too long tearing things down. Now, it was time to create. Elias, on the other hand, was adjusting to school, no longer burdened by the lies of a false identity. He made friends cautiously, still wary of trusting too quickly, but for the first time in months, he felt like a normal teenager. The paranoia that had once followed him like a ghost was fading. One evening, as they sat at the dining table, sharing dinner, Elias looked up from his plate. Did you see the news? Felix wiped his mouth with a napkin. About your mother? Elias nodded. She and Dorian accepted a plea deal. 10 years minimum, fraud, corporate espionage, tax evasion, the works. Felix had seen the reports. The fall of Seraphina Morgenstern and Dorian Huxley had been swift and brutal. Their names were now synonymous with corruption, their legacy erased in disgrace. Elias leaned back in his chair. I don't know how I feel about it. Felix studied his son, his expression unreadable. You don't have to feel anything. She made her choices. Elias sighed. I guess it's just weird, knowing she's gone. Not dead, but gone. Felix understood. No matter what Seraphina had done, she was still Elias's mother. That bond, no matter how fractured, wasn't something that could just disappear. It's okay to feel conflicted, he said, but don't let it hold you back. We have our own lives to live now. Elias nodded, though the distant look in his eyes remained. Felix didn't push further. His son would process things in his own time. The next morning, Felix received an unexpected email. It was from an architecture firm he had admired years ago, one of the few he had always respected. They had heard about his disappearance and subsequent return, and they were offering him a chance to collaborate on a major project. He stared at the message for a long time, realizing that this was his opportunity to start anew, not just for himself, but for Elias, for their future. Later that evening, as they sat in the living room, Felix turned to his son. What would you say if we moved? Not like before, Felix assured him. A real move, a fresh start. No more running, a new city, a new job, a new chapter. What do you think? Elias considered it. He had started to feel comfortable where they were, but deep down he knew his father was right. This place still carried the remnants of the past. Maybe a true fresh start was exactly what they needed. Okay, he said finally. Let's do it. Felix smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. They weren't escaping anymore. They were moving forward, together. And this time they would build something that could never be taken away. The next few weeks were filled with preparations. Felix finalized the paperwork for the move, closed lingering accounts, and secured a new position at the prestigious firm that had reached out to him. Elias, though hesitant at first, began to embrace the idea of a fresh start. One evening, as they packed their belongings, Elias stumbled upon an old photo album. He hesitated before flipping it open. There were pictures of their former life, his parents smiling at a company gala, a family vacation by the beach, and one of Felix, Seraphina, and him at his 10th birthday. For a moment, nostalgia pulled at his chest. Felix, noticing the album, sat down beside him. He didn't speak at first, simply studying the pictures. "Do you ever miss it?" Elias finally asked. Felix sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not the way things turned out, but the way it was before? Sometimes." Elias nodded, tracing a finger over one of the photos. "I don't think I'll ever forgive her." Felix placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "And that's okay. Forgiveness isn't something you owe anyone. You move on when you're ready, on your own terms." Elias shut the album and placed it in the discard pile. "I think I'm ready to leave it behind." Felix smiled. "Me too." A week later, they boarded a flight to their new home. The city was different, unfamiliar, but it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a beginning. Felix started his new job, quickly gaining recognition not just for his skill, but for his integrity. He no longer worked for power or prestige. He worked because he loved what he did. He mentored young architects, ensuring their ideas were recognized, something he wished someone had done for him when he was younger. Elias adjusted to school, making friends without the weight of secrecy. He found himself drawn to architecture, not just because of his father, but because for the first time, he saw the beauty in creating something lasting. Months passed, and life settled into something normal. One evening, Felix and Elias stood on their apartment balcony, overlooking the skyline. "It's weird," Elias mused. "We spent so much time running, planning, worrying, and now it's just life." Felix chuckled. "A quiet life isn't such a bad thing." Elias smirked. "I suppose not." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, Felix felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Their past would always be a part of them, but it no longer defined them. They had survived betrayal, loss, and revenge. Now they were free,